Hello, today is Wednesday, September 22nd, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Ben Fox, one of TC2's managing directors, and Ben and I are going to have a chat about value-added reseller services. Now, value-added reseller services, they are an important part of the ICT ecosystem, and without them, a lot of great products and services would never make it to the enterprise. So let's find out more about value-added reseller services. Hey, Ben, welcome back.
Hello, Joe. It's nice to talk to you again.
So why don't you start off by elaborating a bit on value-added reseller services and why they exist?
Good idea. Yes. So value-added reseller services, or VAR services, are simply the services that many IT providers provide to sell other third parties' products and services to customers. So, for example, when a company wishes to buy Cisco network equipment, for instance, it's very unusual actually to purchase direct from Cisco. Rather, the customer buys Cisco network equipment through a value-added reseller. And that's the same for many IT hardware and products. A lot of IT equipment and software vendors, and they're commonly referred to as original equipment manufacturer or OEMs, they operate channel strategies whereby they prefer to sell to channel partners, that is, VARs, rather than transact directly with customers, which makes working with VARs pretty much inevitable for purchasing products from a range of equipment and software OEMs. But at the same time, enterprises buy such a huge variety of different IT products from a huge variety of different OEMs. It's often far easier to deal with a modest number of VARs rather than have to deal with many individual OEMs.
So what kind of suppliers provide VAR services?
Well, enterprises tend to deal with different types of VARs. So firstly, there are suppliers for which resale is the primary service they offer. So for instance, companies like SHI and WWT, where most of their business is resale, and they are essentially VAR specialists, if you will. And then secondly, many IT service providers offer resale services as a complement to the other services they provide. For example, most large telecom carriers offer VAR services for network hardware, network software, and resold services such as network hardware maintenance and network software subscriptions. And a lot of large systems integrators and IT outsourcing suppliers also provide VAR services. I think particularly for SIs, VAR services can be an important enabler for selling their other services, simply because customers often prefer, or at least find it simpler, to purchase their IT hardware and software from the same partner that will be deploying and or supporting that hardware and software. I think it's worth noting as well, Joe, that one of the things we see is that outside of those VAR specialists I mentioned, suppliers tend to wax and wane a bit on how interested they are in providing VAR services. So sometimes suppliers are targeting revenue growth rather than margin, and other times they can be focusing more on making a healthy margin. VAR services tend to be good for revenue, but it is a low margin business. And we've seen that affect how focused or not focused both systems integrators and telecom carriers are on selling VAR services.
Now, as the name implies, well, actually, it's quite explicit, value added. That means that the suppliers must offer something that's of additional value to customers. Now, maybe that's better distribution, support. I guess it can be any number of things. So, Ben, if you're negotiating a deal, what are some of the key things to focus on when negotiating for VAR services?
Yeah, the principal commercial topic tends to be the markup that the VAR applies to the cost of the goods that the customer is buying. And the markup should really be seen as the charge for the VAR services. And different VARs apply the markup in different ways. So sometimes it's simply a percentage markup of the net cost of the goods sold. Other times the VAR may reduce the discount that the applicable OEM provides by a point or two. So for example, if the OEM provides you with a 60% discount, the VAR might reduce that discount to say 58% by way of the markup for its resale services.
It seems to me that when negotiating the markups, it's important to carefully understand the exact markup calculation.
Absolutely. Not least because we actually see large variances between different suppliers in the net markup that is applied. So for instance, there's a big difference between a 1% markup on the cost of goods sold compared to a 1% reduction in the discount applied. They sound the same, but they actually have a very different net effect on the cost of your purchase. The other less transparent VAR pricing approach we see is where the VAR simply provides the net discount it will provide for different OEMs and for different products. And with that model, you really have no transparency at all on the markup So no transparency on what the VAR is actually charging for its services. We don't think that's a good way of doing business. We find that it's a best practice, hence, to insist that the VAR is transparent on what markup it is charging for its services. And actually, most VARs will readily provide that transparency when you ask for it. And before we finish on markups, it's also important to know that VARs don't necessarily offer a flat or a consistent markup for all transaction types. The markup can vary depending on what country the product is purchased in. Different markups might apply for different OEMs. And the markup may vary depending on whether or not the OEM has to engage an intermediary distributor that sits between the VAR and the OEM. And I promise my final point on markups is that it's really important to clearly define what the markup covers in order to avoid other additional costs and fees later. Really, your objective is that the only additional costs that apply over and above the cost of the product and the markup should be hardware shipping fees and sales taxes. So it's important to seek to avoid having to pay additional fees such as import duties and fees for customs clearance work, fees for import broker fees, fees for exchange rate hedging, additional layers of logistics costs, additional management fees. We've come across all of those types of additional fees.
Man, that's a lot of fees, and I can see how just the markup part of the VAR sourcing effort or negotiation can get quite involved. So apart from the markup, which you just detailed, what else differentiates VARs?
Well, Joe, a major consideration for global companies is the geographic coverage that a VAR can offer. You really cannot take it for granted that a VAR will be able to resell product to you in all of the countries in which you operate. In fact, quite the reverse. And when purchasing hardware, companies typically want to transact with their reseller on an in-country basis, meaning the VAR needs to have an in-country entity and be appropriately licensed to sell the required products in that country. Otherwise, the customer may end up needing to deal with various importation logistics, serving as the importer of record and fulfilling responsibilities and costs associated with that. And avoiding that is exactly why you're engaging with the VAR in the first place, so that they do those things. So it's important to comprehensively vet which countries the VAR can sell to you on a local basis. And then the other coverage question is which OEMs the VAR is authorized to sell. And that may also vary by country. So you can see how this rapidly gets quite complex. So we found a good way to approach all this is to develop a matrix of the OEMs and the countries in which you need to buy hardware and effectively have potential VARs respond to that matrix and fill it out with a specific coverage that they can provide.
You know, I'll bet a lot of enterprises think that these VAR arrangements are pretty straightforward, but as you just highlighted, VAR services can actually quickly get quite complicated.
Yes, definitely. And that's especially true when you're dealing with purchases all over the world. I actually think VAR services, often seem rather mundane, but actually purchases of IT products and services through resellers is typically a very significant part of companies' IT budgets. And so resale is actually quite important, and optimizing the cost of your VAR services can have a quite significant positive impact on your company's bottom line. So the other thing I would say is that even once you've negotiated robust arrangements for VAR services, we find that it's still important to solicit quotes from multiple VARs for individual transactions. And funnily enough, we actually see sometimes that the variation in logistics and shipping charges and even taxes between VARs can actually be greater than the variation in the markup fee. So it's good to get quotes so you can compare those fees over and above your understanding of who's got the cheapest markup. And also a good tip for soliciting quotes when you're doing that is to insist that the VARs break out any different items they aggregate under the term taxes. So the differences between quotes can be better understood and so that nothing is hidden under taxes. For instance, we see sometimes things like importation and customs fees, not taxes, being represented or referred to as taxes in quotes. I know that we're running out of time, Joe, but I did want to make a final point that a customer's arrangements and contracts with VARs, they don't replace or reduce the importance of having relationships with those key OEMs that you purchase products from through those VARs. You can absolutely negotiate certain aspects of transactions of OEM purchases with the reseller, but you absolutely still need to engage directly with the OEM to negotiate the pricing and the terms that the OEM will extend to you through the VAR. And maybe that is something that we can talk about some other time, Joe.
All right. Hey, thanks, Ben. This has really been a very insightful discussion. Now, if you would like to learn more about negotiating and contracting for value-added resale services, or maybe you'd like to discuss other ICT needs with Ben, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, just please give us a call or shoot us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to these Staying Connected podcasts, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.